The story of the Kraken begins with the sea itself. For as long as people have traveled across the oceans, they have imagined what might lurk beneath the waves. The open water is vast, indifferent, and mysterious. It stretches further than the eye can see, and even in the shallowest parts, it conceals more than it reveals. When early sailors set out in fragile wooden ships, they faced not only storms and hunger, but also the unknown. It was in this setting that the Kraken was born, a legend that rose out of fear, imagination, and encounters that seemed too enormous to explain. Long before the word Kraken appeared in print, sailors had been telling stories of monstrous creatures in the deep. The Greeks wrote about Scylla and Charybdis, beings that tore apart ships and devoured men. The Bible mentions Leviathan, a terrifying sea beast beyond human control. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries described something similar, immense creatures with tentacles or coils, dwelling in the depths, waiting to drag ships into darkness. The Kraken became the northern version of this ancient fear, a monster tied specifically to the cold waters around Norway and Greenland, where seafarers pushed their luck against unpredictable seas. The first descriptions of the Kraken were not of a single beast, but of something like an island. Mariners spoke of sailing for hours toward a dark mass rising in the distance, only to find the island heaving, shifting, and sinking. What they thought was land revealed itself as a living thing, larger than anything else in the sea. Some accounts said the Kraken stretched miles across. Its back appeared as a forest of rocks or reefs. Birds gathered above it, mistaking its bulk for land. When it stirred, whirlpools opened, dragging ships into the deep. These stories were terrifying not only for their scale but for their plausibility. To sailors with no maps, no compasses, and no understanding of ocean currents, the idea of a living island was not impossible. The Norse sagas preserved some of these fears. In Icelandic texts from the 13th century, there are mentions of sea monsters called Hafgufa and Lyngbak. The Hafgufa was said to be so massive that sailors mistook it for a landmass. The Lyngbaka resembled a great back covered in seaweed, again mistaken for an island until it moved. Both sound eerily like early forms of the Kraken legend. These stories carried warnings. Do not trust what you see at sea, for the ocean disguises danger as safety. What looks like shelter may be a predator waiting for you to draw near. The Vikings, who sailed farther and braver than most, were especially vulnerable to such tales. Their longships carried them deep into the North Atlantic, where storms rose without warning and fog swallowed the horizon. In those waters, they faced whales larger than their boats, squid that flashed through the depths, and shoals of fish that shifted the water like moving land. The Viking imagination was steeped in a world of giants and gods, where nature itself was alive. To them, the idea of a creature so vast it could drag an entire ship beneath the waves was not only possible but expected. Their world was filled with beings of enormous size and strength. Why should the sea be different? Historical accounts from later centuries began to put more detail on the Kraken. Sailors described long arms or tentacles rising from the water, reaching towards ships, wrapping around masts, and pulling men overboard. Others spoke of whirlpools forming when the beast dove, powerful enough to tear ships apart. Some even described the stench of the creature, a foul odor that lingered in the air as a warning. These details gave the Kraken a more monstrous form, less like an island and more like a living predator. The shape of a giant squid began to emerge in the legend, though no one could prove such creatures existed at the time. Part of the power of the Kraken legend comes from how it draws on real phenomena. The sea does produce whirlpools, often caused by strong currents meeting or by underwater geography, forcing water into spirals. To sailors without charts, these whirlpools seemed like the work of a living thing. Giant squid, though rarely seen, do exist. They can reach lengths of over 40 feet, with eyes the size of dinner plates and arms tipped with hooks. For centuries, they lived in the deep ocean, almost never surfacing where humans could see them. But occasionally, storms or sickness would bring them near the surface or strand them on beaches. Imagine stumbling across such a carcass in an age when natural science was barely beginning. It would not be hard to believe you had found the remains of a monster. The Kraken also reflects the psychology of the sailor. Life at sea was precarious, ships were small and fragile, navigation was uncertain, food was scarce, storms could last for weeks. In this world, the ocean itself was an enemy, and the Kraken embodied its dangers. Instead of a faceless sea swallowing ships, it was a beast, a mind, a predator with intent. Giving the sea a monstrous form made it easier to explain its cruelty. Ships did not vanish because of chance or human error. They vanished because a creature chose to take them. The Kraken turned random misfortune into a story with meaning. The legend also carried a strange allure. For all its terror, the Kraken was said to bring fish. Stories told of sailors dropping nets near the beast and pulling up more than they could carry. The Kraken stirred the sea so violently that schools of fish rose to the surface, offering a bounty to those brave enough to risk it. In this way, the monster was both curse and gift, destruction and abundance. To fishermen, this made sense. The sea itself was like that, generous one day, merciless the next. Over time, the Kraken grew into one of the most iconic sea monsters in human history. It drew from ancient myths of sea beasts, from the experiences of Viking sailors, and from real encounters with strange creatures. It became a name whispered in harbors, a warning passed from sailor to sailor, and eventually a tale that captured the imagination of the world. The Kraken was more than a monster. It was the sea itself, made flesh and intent, waiting in the depths to remind humans of their smallness. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, the Kraken did not disappear into the shadows of sailor gossip. Instead, it entered the written record of natural history, straddling the line between folklore and science. For centuries, there had been no sharp divide between myth and fact when it came to animals. Travelers described what they saw, writers collected those stories, and compilers recorded them in texts that mixed lions and elephants with unicorns and dragons. In that context, the Kraken was not dismissed as superstition. It was taken seriously enough to be studied, debated, and catalogued alongside the creatures of the known world. One of the earliest attempts to describe the Kraken in a scientific manner came from accounts preserved in Scandinavian tradition. Norwegian sailors were especially insistent that the creature was real, and their voices carried weight because of their reputation as skilled navigators. The North Atlantic was their domain, and if they said something lurked in its waters, it was difficult for others to dismiss outright. In these accounts, the Kraken was said to be less common than whales but far more dangerous. Some writers even claimed there were only ever two in existence at a time, as if nature could not sustain more than a pair of such immense beasts. Descriptions from this period shifted between the impossible and the oddly specific. Some insisted the Kraken measured a mile across, its back breaking the surface like a floating island. Others gave more moderate dimensions, suggesting it was several hundred feet long, which still exceeded anything known to science at the time. Its behavior was described in detail, rising slowly from the depths, creating massive whirlpools when it descended, and occasionally lashing out with its arms to seize ships. Sailors were advised to give any unusual swell of water a wide berth, for it might signal the stirring of the beast below. In the early 18th century, a Norwegian bishop named Erik Pontoppidan provided one of the most influential accounts of the Kraken in his work on natural history. He did not dismiss the legend as sailor superstition but treated it as a real, though rare, creature of the northern seas. He repeated the claim that the Kraken was as large as a floating island, and he insisted that its appearances were well known among seafarers. Pontoppidan even suggested that the monster might be the largest animal God had placed on Earth, exceeding whales in both size and power. His writing gave the Kraken an air of credibility that oral tradition alone could not. Pontoppidan's account also included fascinating details that blurred the line between fact and fable. He wrote that when the Kraken surfaced, fishermen took advantage of the disturbance to catch fish, for the smaller creatures of the sea fled the monster's rising bulk and swarmed into the nets. At the same time, he warned of the danger the creature posed, describing the whirlpools it left behind when it sank as strong enough to drag entire ships under. These twin themes of bounty and destruction would remain tied to the Kraken's image, a creature that both provided and annihilated, a reminder of the sea's dual nature. The Renaissance and Enlightenment eras were full of attempts to catalogue and explain the natural world, and the Kraken found its place in that effort. Writers speculated about its nature, often comparing it to known animals. Some believed it was a kind of giant squid, far larger than any specimen yet observed. Others argued it was more like a massive crab, with immense arms that reached from below to clutch at vessels. Still others treated it as a unique creature altogether, belonging to no known category. In each case, the Kraken was presented not as a ghost story but as an undiscovered species awaiting formal recognition. This seriousness did not mean the accounts were free from exaggeration. The sheer scale attributed to the Kraken was almost impossible to imagine. An island-sized beast surfacing beneath a ship would have been immediately destructive. Yet the stories often described sailors escaping after brief encounters. Some claimed the Kraken's body was so vast that entire flocks of birds rested upon it, pecking at the sea life, clinging to its back. Others swore they saw forests of kelp growing across its shell. Such images stretched belief, but they also made the monster unforgettable. The Kraken was not merely large, it was mythically large, something that blurred the line between natural and supernatural. The fascination with the Kraken also reveals something about how people of the time saw the ocean. The sea was still a frontier, vast and only partially explored. The coasts were mapped, but the deep water remained mysterious, dangerous, and full of possibility. For a sailor staring across endless waves, the idea that creatures larger than mountains might dwell beneath was not far-fetched. Whales already reached enormous sizes. If whales existed, why not something even greater, hidden in the deepest trenches? The Kraken represented the fear and awe of a world only beginning to understand the scale of the oceans. Even scholars who doubted the most extreme accounts admitted that something unusual might lurk in the sea. Reports of giant tentacles washed ashore or strange remains pulled from fishing nets were difficult to ignore. These fragments suggested that the Kraken might not be pure invention. It might be an exaggeration of real encounters with creatures rarely seen by humans. The notion of a colossal squid, centuries before science confirmed such animals, was already taking shape through these tales. The Kraken was not just myth but a distorted reflection of reality, shaped by fear and distance. As printing spread and literacy increased, stories of the Kraken reached far beyond Scandinavia. European readers encountered it in travelogues and natural history books, where it was placed alongside dragons, unicorns, and mermaids. Unlike those beings, however, the Kraken had a special weight. It was tied not to distant lands or vague legends, but to the accounts of sailors in real waters. It belonged to the same northern seas that traders and explorers traveled. That proximity gave the monster a lingering credibility. It might not exist, but it might, and that possibility was enough to keep it alive. By the close of the Renaissance, the Kraken had secured a place in both folklore and science. It was feared by sailors, studied by scholars, and whispered about in taverns. It was part natural hazard, part myth, and part scientific puzzle. What began as a shadow on the horizon had become a creature with anatomy, behavior, and a place in natural history texts. The Kraken had moved from the oral tradition of sailors into the printed record of European thought. It was no longer just a story told at sea. It was a monster recognized by the world. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the legend of the Kraken was no longer confined to the realm of sailors' tales and natural history texts. The age of exploration had expanded human contact with the oceans, and as ships ventured farther into uncharted waters, they began to bring back not just stories but fragments of strange creatures that blurred the line between myth and science. The Kraken, once only a whisper of possibility, was now supported by physical encounters that suggested something enormous and real did indeed live in the deep. Throughout this period, reports of mysterious carcasses washing ashore began to circulate. Sailors and villagers described finding massive remains that seemed unlike any known animal. Pieces of tentacle, sometimes thick as a tree trunk, were found tangled in fishing gear or deposited on beaches after storms. These remains were often in poor condition, rotting and incomplete, but they provided enough substance to fuel the imagination. To those who already believed in the Kraken, these discoveries were proof. Here was flesh and bone to support the legend. One famous case came from the coasts of Iceland, where fishermen described pulling up fragments of what looked like a monstrous squid. The arms were longer than a man and covered in strange suction discs. The smell was foul, and the material was slimy and alien to the touch. For men who had grown up hauling whales and fish from the sea, this was something new, something that did not fit into their understanding of the ocean. Stories of these encounters spread quickly, carried by travelers and sailors until they reached scholars who had long debated the Kraken's reality. The descriptions aligned uncannily with what we now know as giant squid. These elusive creatures inhabit the deep ocean, rarely surfacing and almost never appearing intact on land. Yet their existence, long doubted, was hinted at through these chance discoveries. In the 18th century, the concept of a squid large enough to attack ships was still unproven, but the evidence was growing. Fishermen spoke of arms stretching over 20 feet, thick enough to wrap around a mast. Others described battles with creatures that lashed out at their boats, leaving behind scars and sucker marks. Such details transformed the Kraken from an implausible myth into something disturbingly possible. Naturalists of the time began to take notice. The 18th century was a period of classification and cataloguing, when scholars sought to organize the natural world into species and categories. Reports of strange remains from the sea presented a challenge. Were they simply exaggerations of known animals, or did they represent new species that had yet to be studied? Some argued for caution, suggesting that sailors had mistaken whales or other creatures for something extraordinary. Others, more open-minded, argued that the ocean was vast enough to conceal giants we had yet to discover. The possibility of enormous squids captured the imagination of the public as well. Newspapers eagerly published accounts of sea monsters, blending fact with sensationalism. Readers devoured stories of tentacles rising from the waves and ships nearly pulled under by unseen beasts. The Kraken was no longer just a northern legend. It became a global fascination, a symbol of the sea's unfathomable mysteries. For people living far from the coast, these tales offered a glimpse into a world of danger and wonder that stretched beyond their daily lives. By the 19th century, the evidence became harder to dismiss. In 1854, a French naval vessel reported a dramatic encounter with a massive squid near the Canary Islands. Sailors described a creature with long arms that wrapped around the hull, resisting attempts to drive it away. They managed to cut free and recover parts of the animal, though much of it sank. The story spread across Europe, adding credibility to centuries of speculation. This was no longer a vague shadow or a story passed from sailor to sailor. It was a confrontation between men and something tangible, something alive. More encounters followed. In 1873, fishermen off the coast of Newfoundland captured fragments of a giant squid, including a tentacle over 30 feet long. The remains were studied by scientists who confirmed that they belonged to a previously unknown species. For the first time, the existence of giant squid was acknowledged by the scientific community. What had once been dismissed as myth now had a name, a place in zoology, and specimens to prove it. The Kraken had begun to emerge from legend into reality. These discoveries did not settle the debate, however. For many, the existence of giant squid explained the Kraken stories. Sailors had glimpsed or battled these elusive creatures and exaggerated their size and power, but others argued that the sightings and carcasses did not fully account for the most extreme claims. The whirlpools, the island-sized beasts, the catastrophic sinkings, could all of those be reduced to squid? Some insisted that the true Kraken remained larger, rarer, and more dangerous than anything science had yet found. The legend survived even as parts of it were explained. What made this period so significant was the interplay between myth and evidence. The Kraken was no longer just a creature of imagination. It had a foothold in reality. Carcasses proved that enormous squid existed, and encounters at sea showed that they could be dangerous. Yet the mythic dimensions of the Kraken, its vastness and power, remained untouched by these discoveries. Science explained part of the mystery, but not all. The Kraken lived on, both as a real animal glimpsed in fragments and as a monster of the human mind. This tension between explanation and mystery reflects something essential about human storytelling. We crave both knowledge and wonder. When confronted with the unknown, we seek answers, but we also resist losing the magic of possibility. The 19th century encounters with giant squids satisfied curiosity but did not kill the legend. Instead, they gave it new life. The Kraken could now be both, a creature of scientific fact and a monster of folklore. People could point to real specimens and still whisper about giants that dwarfed them. The two versions reinforced each other, blending reality and myth in a way that kept the story alive. By the close of the 19th century, the Kraken had secured its place not only in folklore but in natural history. Scientists accepted the existence of giant squid, but the legend of something larger, more terrifying, and more mysterious remained. The ocean was vast, after all, and even with new ships and new science, much of it was still unexplored. What else might be waiting in its depths? The Kraken remained a question, a reminder that the sea still held secrets too large to ignore. By the 19th century, the Kraken had become more than a sailor's nightmare or a scientist's puzzle. It was now an image that belonged to the wider culture, reshaped by art, literature, and popular imagination. The creature that once haunted the waters of Norway and Greenland began to appear in poems, engravings, and novels, not just as a piece of folklore but as a symbol of the unknown itself. The sea was still largely mysterious, and the Kraken became its embodiment, a living metaphor for forces too vast to comprehend. One of the earliest and most influential literary appearances of the Kraken came from the English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. In 1830, he published a sonnet simply titled The Kraken. In it, he described a massive creature lying in the deep, sleeping for ages until one day it would rise to the surface and die. Tennyson's Kraken was not simply a sea monster but a symbol of hidden power, something ancient and unfathomable that rested beneath the calm surface of the world. His poem captured the Victorian fascination with what lay beneath, the idea that the ocean concealed not only creatures but truths about existence itself. Tennyson's poem was short, but it resonated. It placed the Kraken firmly in the literary imagination of the English-speaking world, ensuring that the monster was not just a sailor's tale, but a subject for poets and thinkers. This shift marked a new stage in the Kraken's history. The creature was no longer bound to specific sightings or reports of carcasses. It had become an image, a symbol that could stand for mystery, danger, or even apocalypse. Artists of the 19th century also embraced the Kraken. Engravings and illustrations began to depict the monster as a titanic squid or octopus, its tentacles wrapping around ships, pulling masts down into the sea, and dragging sailors to their doom. These images, printed in newspapers, books, and pamphlets, gave the Kraken a visual form that could spread faster and further than oral tales ever had. A reader in London or Paris could see what the Kraken looked like without ever setting foot near the North Atlantic. The monster became more vivid and terrifying, no longer just a vague story but a picture etched in the imagination. The 19th century was also the age of Romanticism, when artists and writers were fascinated by the sublime, the feeling of awe mixed with terror when confronted with something immense and uncontrollable. Mountains, storms, and oceans were common subjects for this aesthetic, and the Kraken fit perfectly into that mood. It was not simply a threat. It was an overwhelming force of nature, a reminder of humanity's fragility in the face of the world's vastness. To depict the Kraken was to depict the sublime itself. As science advanced, so did the tension between explanation and myth. The discovery of real giant squid in the late 19th century provided a scientific anchor for the Kraken, but it did not rob it of its mystery. Instead, it fueled the imagination further. If squids could reach lengths of 40 feet or more, who was to say there were not larger ones, still hidden in the deep? The confirmed existence of giant squid gave the Kraken a new lease on life. It was no longer dismissed as impossible. Instead, it became plausible, even likely, that creatures beyond human knowledge still swam in the abyss. Writers seized on this possibility. Jules Verne, in his 1870 novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, famously described a battle between Captain Nemo's submarine and a giant squid. Verne's account was vivid, dramatic, and unforgettable. His squid was not called the Kraken, but the image of writhing arms clutching a vessel and dragging men to their deaths was the Kraken in all but name. Verne's work spread across the world, reaching audiences who might never have heard of Scandinavian folklore. In the minds of readers, the Kraken became not only a northern monster but a universal one, a terror of the sea that could rise anywhere. Newspapers also played their part in sustaining the legend. The 19th century was a golden age of sensational reporting, when stories of strange creatures and bizarre discoveries sold papers. Reports of sea serpents, monstrous fish, and squid attacks appeared regularly. The Kraken, with its mix of myth and emerging scientific evidence, fit perfectly into this appetite for the extraordinary. Whether described in sober natural history terms or in lurid journalistic style, it was a story that never failed to capture attention. What makes this period remarkable is the way the Kraken transitioned from folklore to culture, from a local legend to a global icon. The creature was no longer tied only to the cold waters of the North Atlantic. It had become a symbol that artists and writers could use to express fear, awe, or the unknown. The Kraken was malleable. It could be a poetic metaphor, a scientific puzzle, a monstrous villain, or a sublime image of nature's power. Each new portrayal added another layer to the legend, making it richer and more complex. At the same time, the Kraken began to embody the anxieties of the age. The 19th century was a time of rapid change, with industrialization transforming society and science expanding knowledge at a dizzying pace. The ocean, vast and unmapped, remained one of the last frontiers. The Kraken represented what was left unexplained, a reminder that even as humans mastered steam engines and railways, there were still forces beyond their control. In a sense, the Kraken was the shadow of progress, lurking beneath the surface as a counterweight to human ambition. By the turn of the 20th century, the Kraken was firmly established as one of the great monsters of Western imagination. It had literary prestige through Tennyson, artistic form through engravings, scientific plausibility through discoveries of giant squid, and popular appeal through newspapers and novels. The creature that began as a whisper among Viking sailors had become a universal symbol of the deep. It was no longer just a story told in northern taverns. It was part of the cultural fabric of the modern world. This transformation shows how myths survive by adapting. The Kraken had changed form many times, from an island beast to a squid-like predator, from sailor superstition to scientific possibility, from local legend to cultural icon. Each era reshaped it to reflect its own fears and fascinations. That adaptability ensured its survival. While other monsters faded into obscurity, the Kraken grew larger, not only in size but in meaning. It was no longer just a question of whether it existed. It had become a symbol of everything the sea represented: danger, mystery, and power. The 20th century brought changes that reshaped nearly every corner of human life, and the Kraken was not left behind. Technology advanced at a pace that seemed unstoppable. Ships grew larger, submarines descended deeper, and airplanes crossed oceans in hours instead of weeks. The world was shrinking, mysteries were being solved, and the natural world was catalogued with unprecedented precision. Yet the Kraken, far from fading, found new ways to survive in this modern era. It slipped from the realm of natural history into the broader landscape of popular culture, carried forward by art, cinema, and storytelling. What is remarkable about the Kraken's endurance is how it adapted to new mediums. In earlier centuries, it had lived in sailors' tales, naturalists' books, and woodcut illustrations. Now, it appeared on film reels, comic book pages, and radio broadcasts. Each time it entered a new medium, the Kraken was reshaped for its audience. It was no longer bound to the cold waters of Norway. It became a universal symbol of terror and mystery, appearing wherever the story demanded a colossal enemy from the deep. Silent films of the early 20th century occasionally played with sea monsters, though technical limits kept their depictions simple. Still, the idea of massive creatures lurking beneath the waves captured the imagination of filmmakers and audiences alike. By the time special effects began to develop in the mid-century, the Kraken was ripe for reinvention. Tentacles thrashing across the screen, ships tossed about in miniature oceans, sailors screaming as they were dragged below. These images became staples of monster cinema. Even when the films avoided calling the creature by its old name, the Kraken's silhouette was unmistakable. One of the reasons the Kraken thrived in this new medium is that its very form suited spectacle. A monster with tentacles can be shown in fragments, an arm curling around a mast, a shadow rising beneath the water, a glimpse of an eye. The creature could be enormous without requiring a full, detailed image. It played into the power of suggestion, which film was uniquely able to exploit. The Kraken was ideal for cinema because it did not need to be fully seen to be terrifying. At the same time, literature in the 20th century embraced the Kraken as a metaphor for forces beyond human control. Writers used it to describe everything from political upheaval to personal despair. The idea of something massive, hidden, and threatening rising from the depths proved endlessly adaptable. Poets drew on Tennyson's earlier imagery, while novelists used the Kraken as shorthand for any overwhelming and unseen danger. It became part of the cultural vocabulary, invoked whenever people wanted to describe the unfathomable. The Kraken also influenced emerging genres like science fiction and fantasy. Writers who sought to create new worlds often borrowed from old myths, and the Kraken was one of the most enduring. In fantasy, it appeared as a guardian of oceans, an obstacle for heroes, or a weapon of gods. In science fiction, it was reimagined as an alien form, transferred from sea to space, but retaining its tentacled menace. These reinventions kept the Kraken relevant, proving that even in an age of modernity, old myths could be endlessly reworked. But the 20th century also brought something new. Science began to close in on the reality behind the Kraken. With improved deep-sea exploration, researchers started to confirm the existence of giant squid in more detail. Photographs of their bodies, specimens captured for study, and encounters at sea provided proof of creatures that once seemed impossible. The Kraken's myth was grounded in these discoveries, though the scientific explanations never fully erased the older fears. In fact, the confirmation of giant squid only added fuel to the fire. If such creatures truly existed, perhaps even larger ones were still hidden. This blend of science and imagination is what defined the Kraken in the modern age. It was both real and unreal at the same time. On one hand, giant squid could be studied, dissected, and measured. On the other hand, the idea of something even greater, something that matched the old stories of island-sized beasts, remained alluring. The Kraken was no longer a single creature but a spectrum. It could be the confirmed squid of biology, the cinematic monster of fantasy, or the metaphorical beast of literature. Each version reinforced the others, making the legend harder to dismiss. Popular culture began to embrace the Kraken not only as a monster, but as a symbol of entertainment itself. Board games, comic strips, and pulp novels featured it in various forms. Radio programs dramatized stories of sailors fighting off monstrous tentacles. The Kraken became shorthand for the primal fear of the ocean, something that audiences could immediately understand. Its image was flexible, capable of appearing in horror stories one moment and children's adventures the next. By the late 20th century, the Kraken had cemented itself in mainstream entertainment. Films with larger budgets and better effects could finally attempt to show the entire creature, often with mixed results. Some depictions leaned toward horror, with the Kraken dragging ships into the abyss. Others leaned towards spectacle, making the monster part of grand, almost operatic battles. Regardless of style, the Kraken was always presented as a force of nature, too vast to be fully defeated, too terrifying to be ignored. Meanwhile, the legend continued to resonate in real life. Tourists visiting Northern Europe asked about the Kraken as readily as they asked about Viking history. Museums displayed giant squid specimens under banners that evoked the old monster. The line between science and myth blurred further, with Kraken imagery used to advertise aquariums, seaside festivals, and even products. What had once been a terrifying story whispered on storm-tossed ships was now a global brand, recognizable even to children who had never heard the original folklore. Yet for all the commercial use, the Kraken never lost its darker edge. Even as it appeared on toy packaging or in cartoons, it remained tied to fear of the unknown. The ocean is still vast, still largely unexplored, and the thought that something monstrous might be waiting in its depths has never left us. The Kraken thrives on that fear, evolving with the times but never straying far from its roots. By the end of the 20th century, The Kraken stood at a crossroads. It was both entertainment and enigma, both myth and science, both terrifying and playful. Few creatures of folklore have managed such adaptability. The Kraken's survival shows how a legend can transform without ever truly losing its core. At its heart, the Kraken is the embodiment of deep water mystery, a reminder that no matter how advanced humanity becomes, the ocean will always hold secrets too vast to tame. The turn of the 21st century brought with it a world that seemed to leave little room for monsters. Satellites scanned every coastline, submarines probed the depths, and high-definition cameras recorded life in environments once thought unreachable. On the surface, it appeared as though the mysteries that had fueled tales like the Kraken were being eroded by science and technology. Yet instead of disappearing, the Kraken found new life in this era. The monster was reimagined for a generation raised on digital media, video games, and cinematic universes. It shifted once again, proving its resilience as a legend. One of the most striking aspects of the Kraken in the modern world is its ability to thrive in both serious scientific conversation and playful popular culture. On one hand, deep-sea exploration brought the first ever video footage of living giant squid. For centuries, these creatures had been spoken of but never filmed. The footage, captured in the early 2000s, was haunting and surreal. A massive squid moved through the dark waters, its long arms trailing behind it, its eye gleaming in the light of the camera. The moment was hailed as one of the great discoveries of modern marine biology, yet as soon as the images spread, comparisons to the Kraken were inevitable. The old stories of monstrous tentacles rising from the sea were suddenly reinforced by real, living proof. On the other hand, the Kraken was everywhere in entertainment. Video games depicted it as a boss monster, appearing from the depths to crush ships or drag heroes beneath the waves. Blockbuster films used it as the ultimate sea creature, unleashed in grand spectacles of destruction. Even light-hearted cartoons portrayed it, often as a bumbling but lovable character. The Kraken's image had become so deeply embedded in culture that it could be serious one moment and comedic the next. That flexibility made it timeless, immune to being pinned down by a single interpretation. The internet age accelerated this transformation. Memes, artwork, and stories spread rapidly online, reshaping the Kraken for each community that embraced it. Some portrayed it in awe, others in jest, and still others in horror. The Kraken became part of internet folklore, a creature invoked whenever people needed an image of something overwhelming and unstoppable. Its name was used as a metaphor for unleashing power, for facing chaos, or for confronting something too large to control. In this way, the Kraken extended beyond the sea entirely. It became an idea, a symbol adaptable to any context. At the same time, scientific discoveries kept the legend grounded. The study of giant squid revealed more about their biology, their behavior, and their size. Some specimens stretched over 40 feet, with eyes the size of dinner plates and suction cups lined with sharp hooks. These details fueled the imagination further. If such creatures existed, largely unseen in the deep, why not larger ones? The ocean remains mostly unexplored, with vast areas humans have never visited. The Kraken's plausibility endures precisely because the sea still guards its secrets. Modern science, instead of erasing the myth, has kept it alive by showing how much we still do not know. The Kraken also found a place in modern storytelling that reflected contemporary fears. In earlier centuries it represented the chaos of the sea, but now it often symbolized larger, more abstract anxieties. Environmental concerns, climate change, and the fragility of ecosystems gave the Kraken new relevance. It was depicted as nature's retaliation, a monster awakened by human exploitation of the oceans. In these stories, the Kraken was not just a beast, but a metaphor for consequences too vast to control. The old terror of the sea had become a new warning about humanity's relationship with the planet. Cultural fascination with the Kraken also reflects a deeper longing in the modern world. Despite our technology, we still crave mystery. We live in an era of constant information, where answers are only a search away. Yet there is something deeply unsatisfying about total explanation. People want to believe that the world still holds secrets, that not everything has been tamed or mapped. The Kraken represents that possibility. It reminds us that even with satellites and submarines, there are places beyond our reach where creatures larger than our imagination may still dwell. Tourism in regions associated with the Kraken also benefited from this renewed interest. Norway and Iceland leaned into the legend, with tours and exhibits highlighting both the folklore and the science. Museums displayed giant squid specimens beside panels describing the old stories. Tour operators told tales of the Kraken to visitors eager for a brush with myth. The legend had become an asset, part of cultural identity and economic opportunity. It was no longer only a fear of sailors. It was part of a shared heritage, celebrated as much as feared. Perhaps most fascinating is the way the Kraken continues to bridge the gap between generations. Older audiences remember the monster from novels and films of the mid-20th century, while younger audiences encounter it through games and digital culture. Yet both recognize the same essence, the Kraken as the ultimate sea creature, a being of overwhelming size and mystery. Its continuity across time shows how flexible myths can be, adapting to new technologies and new fears while keeping their core intact. Modern depictions often emphasize the scale of the Kraken in exaggerated ways. Films show it dragging entire fleets beneath the waves, while games portray it as larger than mountains. These exaggerations reflect our age of spectacle, where bigger always seems better. Yet even in these outsized portrayals, the core idea remains the same as it was centuries ago. The Kraken is the sea's embodiment of power, a force beyond human control. Whether it is the size of an island or merely a very large squid, it represents the same truth. The ocean is larger, darker, and more powerful than we are prepared to admit. By the middle of the 21st century, the Kraken had become more than folklore, more than science, and more than entertainment. It was a symbol that operated on multiple levels at once. To scientists, it was a reminder of the mysteries that remain in the deep. To artists, it was an endless source of imagery. To storytellers, it was a metaphor for forces too vast to tame. To ordinary people, it was a piece of culture that could appear on a t-shirt, in a video game, or in a poem, instantly recognizable and endlessly adaptable. What is striking about the Kraken in this era is not simply that it survives, but that it thrives. Legends usually weaken as they are explained, yet the Kraken has grown stronger, not in spite of scientific discovery, but because of it. The confirmation of giant squid gave the myth credibility, while the unexplored depths of the sea leave space for even greater possibilities. The monster lives on not only in stories but in the imagination of a world that still wants to believe there are mysteries left. Long before the Kraken rose in the tales of northern sailors, humanity had already filled the oceans with monsters of the imagination. Every culture that lived beside great bodies of water gave them guardians, predators, or demons. These ancient myths did not describe the Kraken directly, but they prepared the ground for it. They showed how natural fear of the sea became personified, transformed into creatures that gave shape to the unknown. The Kraken, as we understand it, is part of a lineage stretching back thousands of years, a continuation of the way people have always explained the ocean. One of the oldest sea monsters to appear in myth is Leviathan. Described in the Hebrew scriptures, Leviathan was a massive creature of chaos, a twisting serpent of the deep that could not be defeated by human hands. It was a symbol of both terror and divine power, an image that merged the unpredictability of the sea with the wrath of creation itself. Leviathan was not merely an animal but a force of nature, embodying everything humans feared about the water's capacity to destroy. Its legend influenced later ideas of sea beasts, including the great monsters of medieval Europe. The Greeks had their own watery horrors. Scylla and Charybdis haunted the narrow straits, one devouring sailors with her snapping mouths and the other pulling ships down with her whirlpool. These myths were rooted in the dangers of navigating treacherous coastal waters, where rocks and currents could tear a vessel apart. To the Greeks, such hazards felt alive, as if the sea itself had intent. By giving these dangers monstrous forms, they made sense of accidents that otherwise seemed random. Scylla and Charybdis became warnings in story as well as practical navigation markers. They also set the stage for later tales of the Kraken, which was likewise tied to whirlpools, destruction, and overwhelming force. The Norse myths, closer to the birthplace of the Kraken legend, also contain a massive sea creature, Jörmungandr, the world's serpent. This being encircled the entire earth, lying coiled in the sea until the day it would rise and bring about the end of the world. Jörmungandr was both myth and metaphor, a creature that represented the boundary between the known and the unknown, the land and the endless waters. It was too large to fight, too vast to comprehend. In its coils, we see a direct ancestor of the Kraken's overwhelming scale. The idea that the ocean could contain beings larger than continents was not just folklore but cosmology. Celtic traditions also contain water spirits and monsters, many of which blur the line between beauty and terror. Kelpies and water horses lured riders into lakes, only to drag them beneath the surface. While these were not giants like the Kraken, they reflected the same theme. The surface of water hides danger. What looks calm or inviting can be deadly. This motif traveled across Europe, shaping a worldview in which water was never to be trusted. When stories of the Kraken began to circulate, they tapped into this pre-existing fear. People were already primed to believe that the sea was alive with predators. Even further afield, we find stories of ocean monsters that echo the Kraken. In Polynesian traditions, there are tales of immense sea gods and creatures that control storms and waves. These beings often test or punish sailors, demanding respect for the ocean. In Japan, myths speak of umibozu, shadowy figures rising from the sea to capsize ships. In each of these traditions, the pattern is the same. The sea is not empty, it has presence, intention, and danger embodied in monstrous forms. What all of these myths share is the recognition of the sea as both necessary and terrifying. For ancient people, water was life. It provided food, travel, and trade. But it was also death, swallowing ships and people without warning. The ocean was a paradox, essential and hostile. Myths of sea monsters expressed this tension. They were cautionary tales, teaching respect for the water. They also gave grief and fear a form. When a ship vanished, families could say it was taken by a monster rather than by chance. That story provided meaning in the face of loss. The Kraken fits into this tradition perfectly. Its earliest descriptions as an island that turned out to be alive echo ancient warnings about deceptive waters. Its association with whirlpools mirrors Charybdis. Its vastness recalls Jörmungandr. Its unpredictability reflects Leviathan. In this sense, the Kraken is not an isolated invention but part of a much older pattern. It is the northern expression of a universal truth. Humans everywhere imagined the sea as inhabited because emptiness was too frightening to accept. As exploration expanded, these myths began to overlap. Sailors traveling between cultures carried stories with them. A Greek tale of Scylla might sound similar to a Norse tale of Hafgufa. A biblical Leviathan might resemble a Celtic water beast. These connections blurred over time, merging into a shared tradition of sea monsters that crossed languages and borders. By the time the Kraken appeared in Scandinavian lore, it was already part of this shared mythology. It was new, but it was also familiar, another chapter in an ancient story about the dangers of the deep. What makes the Kraken stand out among these myths is how it endured into the modern age. Leviathan, Jörmungandr, and Scylla remained mythic, tied to religion and ancient literature. The Kraken, by contrast, lingered in sailors' tales long enough to collide with science. That persistence gave it a second life beyond mythology, allowing it to move into natural history, art, and eventually modern entertainment. But its roots are clear. It is one more embodiment of the fear of the sea, one more monstrous guardian of the waters, shaped by the same forces that gave birth to Leviathan and the world serpent. In recognizing this lineage, the Kraken becomes more than just a northern legend. It is a symbol of how human beings everywhere confronted the ocean. The specific names and shapes vary, but the pattern is universal. The sea is vast, it is dangerous, it cannot be controlled. Therefore, it must have monsters. The Kraken is our modern reminder of this ancient truth, carrying forward the same fears that haunted sailors thousands of years ago. It is not simply a creature of folklore, but a vessel for humanity's oldest anxieties about survival and the unknown. The most enduring power of the Kraken lies not in poetry or paintings, but in the testimonies of sailors who swore they had seen something in the water. Folklore is one thing, but journals, ship logs, and letters written at sea carry a different kind of weight. These accounts, scattered across centuries, reveal how the legend spread not only through imagination but through lived experience. When men who had spent their lives on the water described strange encounters, people listened. The Kraken was not only a creature of myth but a recurring problem in the daily life of those who dared to cross dangerous seas. Mariners were, by necessity, close observers of the ocean. Their survival depended on reading the waves, the clouds, and the movements of animals. Because of this, their reports of unusual phenomena carried authority. If a sailor described a sudden whirlpool where none should exist, or a shape larger than a whale rising from the depths, it was not dismissed as quickly as a story told in a tavern. These men had no luxury to invent distractions. Their words were tied to their reputation, and yet many did write of things that sounded like encounters with the Kraken. Some journals describe moments of dread when a shadow seemed to stretch beneath the ship, vast and silent, giving the impression of a creature as large as the vessel itself. The sailors would hold their breath, unsure if the thing below was moving or if it was only a trick of the water. On occasion, the shadow would vanish as suddenly as it appeared, leaving the men shaken. These moments often turned into stories of the Kraken, a way to explain the unsettling presence of something massive and unseen in the deep. Other accounts mention the sudden boiling of the sea, as though a great body was stirring beneath. Bubbles, froth, and swirling currents would appear, disrupting calm waters in a way no storm could explain. Sailors often blamed these disturbances on the Kraken. They described the ocean as alive beneath them, shifting and rising with intent. Whether the cause was volcanic activity, unusual currents, or something else, the explanation was often the same: the Kraken was moving below. There are also reports of direct confrontations. In the 18th and 19th centuries, some crews described tentacles striking the sides of their ships, slapping the water with a force that rattled the planks. In some cases, suction marks were allegedly left behind, as though the beast had briefly grasped the vessel before retreating. These stories fueled the image of the Kraken as an active predator, reaching from below to seize its prey. While skeptics argued these were exaggerated encounters with large squid, the sailors themselves often insisted they had faced something greater than ordinary nature. One Norwegian account describes a ship surrounded by countless fish, a sudden abundance that seemed unnatural. The crew realized they were in the presence of the Kraken, for the legend said fish fled toward the surface when the beast stirred. The men dropped nets and pulled up a miraculous catch, but fear kept them from celebrating. They rowed hard, desperate to escape before the creature itself rose from the depths. In this story, the Kraken was both a blessing and a curse, giving food while threatening destruction. The dual nature of the monster mirrored the dual nature of the sea itself. Naval officers, too, occasionally recorded unusual sightings. Unlike fishermen or merchants, officers kept formal logs, which meant their words carried even more authority. When they described massive shapes or unexplainable movements in the water, the reports traveled far. One 19th century officer described a creature with long arms breaking the surface, thrashing violently as if in distress. His men watched in silence, unable to intervene. The event lasted only minutes, but it left the crew convinced they had glimpsed the legendary Kraken. Such records gave the myth a kind of legitimacy that tavern gossip never could. The common thread in all these testimonies is the mixture of awe and fear. Sailors often struggled to describe what they had seen. Their words were filled with comparisons: larger than a whale, wider than an island, longer than the ship itself. These exaggerations reflected both the enormity of the experience and the limits of human language. When faced with something incomprehensible, the mind reaches for the largest comparisons available. The Kraken became a way to fill that gap, a name for what could not otherwise be explained. It is also important to understand the psychological strain of life at sea. Weeks or months without sight of land, constant exposure to danger, hunger, and exhaustion all shape the perceptions of sailors. In such conditions, The mind was prone to magnify ordinary events into extraordinary ones. A school of whales could seem like a monster, a submerged rock could appear as a living back, yet these distortions do not make the stories meaningless. They reveal how the legend of the Kraken was born, not only from the ocean's mysteries but from the human need to interpret them. The persistence of these accounts shows that the Kraken was more than invention. It was a shared experience across generations of sailors who encountered strange, overwhelming events at sea. Each story added to the legend, layering detail upon detail until the Kraken took on a life of its own. What began as shadows and currents became tentacles and eyes, a full creature imagined into existence by centuries of testimony. Even when science began to explain some of these encounters as giant squid or natural phenomena, the stories retained their power. They carried the weight of lived experience, which is harder to dismiss than theory. By the time these accounts reached the public, often through newspapers or word of mouth in ports, they had already grown in the telling. Sailors, like all storytellers, emphasized the most dramatic moments, the brush of a tentacle, the sudden whirlpool, the feeling of being watched from below. The Kraken was born in these retellings as much as in the events themselves. In this way, the creature was not only a monster of the sea, but a monster of narrative, shaped by the human need to share and exaggerate. What emerges from this history of testimonies is a picture of the Kraken as both real and unreal. The sailors who saw it believed in their encounters. Their words were not idle fabrications, but attempts to make sense of moments that defied explanation. Yet the collective weight of these stories created something larger than any single event. The Kraken was no longer just what one man saw on one voyage. It was the sum of centuries of voices, a composite monster built from shadows, currents, carcasses, and fear. This accumulation of testimony ensured that the Kraken would never fade. Even as naturalists explained giant squid, even as skeptics dismissed exaggerations, the stories remained. They carried an emotional truth, if not a scientific one. The sailors had faced something vast, something that made them feel small and powerless. The Kraken gave that experience a name, and once named, it could never be forgotten. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the Kraken had escaped the ocean entirely. No longer confined to the stories of sailors or the reports of naturalists, it became a cultural metaphor, an image used in politics, literature, and art to represent power that was hidden yet overwhelming. The monster shifted from a creature of the sea to a symbol of anything vast and uncontrollable, and in this transformation it gained a strange kind of immortality. Artists of the 19th century were particularly drawn to the Kraken's form. The tentacle became a powerful image, capable of stretching across canvases and wrapping around ships, towers, or even whole cities. In many prints and engravings, the Kraken was no longer a beast in the literal sense, but a visual metaphor for conquest and domination. The curling arms represented a reach that could not be escaped. In an age of empire and industrial expansion, these images resonated. They spoke to fears of forces that extended beyond borders, grasping and consuming. Political cartoonists quickly adopted the Kraken's form as well. Its tentacles were too useful a metaphor to ignore. In newspapers, governments, corporations, and even entire nations were drawn as Kraken-like figures, their arms stretching outward to ensnare smaller states or vulnerable industries. The imagery was clear. Just as the sea monster dragged ships beneath the waves, so too did these powers pull others under their control. Readers who might never have heard of the Norwegian legend understood instantly what the image meant. The Kraken became shorthand for corruption, greed, and unstoppable influence. Writers also seized on the image. Beyond its role as a literal monster in adventure stories, the Kraken was used as a symbol of hidden menace. In essays and speeches, the term appeared to describe complex systems that seemed impossible to fight, whether political, economic, or social. The monster's defining quality, its size and invisibility until it struck, mirrored the way people experienced vast institutions. You could not see the whole of it at once, only feel its grip when it tightened. The Kraken was no longer just a beast in the deep, but a stand-in for any oppressive force. The metaphoric use of the Kraken shows how myths evolve with human needs. When sailors needed a story to explain the terrors of the sea, the the Kraken gave them one. When societies needed an image to describe unseen powers, the Kraken served again. Its adaptability made it durable, a monster that could be both literal and figurative, both terrifying and useful as symbolism, was bound to endure. Few other legendary creatures managed such a transformation. Dragons remained tied to fantasy, vampires to gothic horror. The Kraken, meanwhile, moved easily between myth and metaphor. This period also marked the monster's integration into national identity, particularly in the north. For Norway and Iceland, the Kraken became part of cultural heritage, a story to be told alongside sagas and legends of the sea. It was invoked in literature and song, not only as a frightening figure but as a symbol of the raw power of northern waters. Even as science grew more skeptical, people clung to the creature as part of their shared history. The Kraken became a cultural marker, an emblem of the mysterious seas that had shaped northern life for centuries. At the same time, the Kraken's image became global. With the spread of print culture, it traveled far beyond Scandinavia. Readers in Europe and America encountered the monster in magazines and novels, often stripped of its cultural origins but enriched with new meanings. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Kraken was firmly embedded in global imagination. It was no longer only a northern monster, it was the sea monster, the default image for terror beneath the waves. The political use of the Kraken deserves special attention because it reveals how deeply the image resonated. When cartoonists drew its tentacles stretching across maps, they tapped into a primal fear of entrapment. A single tentacle was threatening enough, but the Kraken had many, each capable of reaching in a different direction. This made it an ideal metaphor for forces that felt invasive and unstoppable. People understood that the true danger was not only in one grasp but in the sense that there were always more arms waiting, hidden, ready to strike. Literary uses of the Kraken also reflected shifting anxieties. In an age of industrialization, the monster was sometimes described as a metaphor for machinery itself, an unstoppable system grinding forward with no regard for human life. In times of war, it represented enemy forces that seemed overwhelming and inescapable. The sea monster of the north became a mirror for whatever society most feared at the time. The Kraken was not static, it was a shape into which new fears could be poured. The adaptability of the Kraken is perhaps why it outlasted so many other myths. Most monsters remain tethered to their original context, fading when that context disappears. The Kraken was different. Its form, vast, hidden, tentacled, was abstract enough to be applied to countless situations. It was not tied to a single moral lesson, like some folklore figures, nor bound to a narrow geography. Instead, it evolved into a flexible symbol. That flexibility kept it alive in art, politics, and speech long after many of its mythic contemporaries were forgotten. This does not mean the Kraken lost its identity as a sea monster. On the contrary, its maritime origins gave it credibility and texture. The ocean remained a powerful source of metaphor in its own right, a reminder of the unknown. By linking itself to the sea, the Kraken retained an aura of mystery even when used as a metaphor for landlocked concerns. The ocean is endless, unpredictable, and indifferent. To describe something as Kraken-like was to invoke not only power but the ancient fear of the deep. By the close of the 20th century, the Kraken had become more than a legend. It was a cultural force, a symbol that appeared in serious debates as easily as in stories and entertainment. Its reach extended far beyond the sailors who first spoke of it. It had become an idea, a concept used to describe forces that were too large, too hidden, and too overwhelming to be faced directly. The Kraken had transcended its body, real or imagined, to live as metaphor. And in doing so, it had secured a new kind of immortality. By the time the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Kraken was no longer just a figure of folklore or political metaphor. It had become a fixture of modern entertainment, reshaped for audiences who consumed stories through film, television, games, and novels. The monster that once haunted the imaginations of sailors was now a star of cinematic battles, a challenge for digital heroes, and a recurring presence in the fantasy landscapes of popular culture. This transformation was not simply a matter of spectacle, it reflected the way the Kraken's image adapted to the needs of each generation, always finding a place in whatever medium carried the world's stories. Cinema was the first arena where the Kraken's reinvention took root. Early special effects allowed filmmakers to create convincing images of massive creatures rising from the sea, their tentacles lashing out against wooden ships or modern vessels. Even when the creatures were not explicitly named as the Kraken, audiences recognized them. The curling arms, the sudden strike from beneath, the overwhelming scale, these hallmarks of the old legend were carried forward. The Kraken became part of the cinematic language of monsters, as recognizable as the vampire's fangs or the werewolf's howl. One of the reasons the Kraken thrived in film is that it embodied spectacle. The sudden eruption of a giant creature from the deep provided visual drama unlike any other. Audiences were drawn to the moment of emergence, the clash between fragile humans and overwhelming force. The Kraken's form allowed filmmakers to build suspense, showing only fragments of the creature at first, a single tentacle curling above the waves, the ripple of something vast moving below, before revealing the full scale of the beast. This technique mirrored the way sailors had once described their encounters, half-seen shapes and unsettling shadows, transformed into cinematic tension. Television followed suit, particularly in genres that thrived on adventure and fantasy. The Kraken appeared in serialized dramas, cartoons, and even educational programming. It became a familiar image for children as well as adults, appearing as both a terrifying adversary and a comedic exaggeration. This range of portrayals demonstrates the flexibility of the legend. The Kraken could be reimagined as monstrous or playful, depending on the needs of the story. It was no longer confined to a single tone. It had become a cultural icon, capable of shifting from horror to humor without losing its identity. Video games provided another medium in which the Kraken flourished. The structure of games, built around challenges, battles, and bosses, was perfectly suited to the legend. Players guided ships across digital oceans, only to face sudden attacks from massive tentacles. Others explored fantasy worlds where the Kraken guarded treasures or served as the final obstacle to victory. In this medium, the Kraken was more than a story. It was an experience, something players fought directly. This interactivity gave the legend new life, allowing audiences not only to hear of the monster but to test themselves against it. Fantasy literature, too, embraced the Kraken. Writers who built worlds filled with magic and monsters often borrowed the image of the colossal sea creature. Sometimes it appeared under its old name, other times it was disguised as a different beast, but the essence was the same. The Kraken became a trope of fantasy oceans, a creature lurking just below the surface of every mysterious sea. Its inclusion gave stories a sense of scale and danger, reminding readers that the oceans of these invented worlds were no safer than the real ones. Part of what made the Kraken so appealing in modern media was its adaptability. Unlike creatures tied to specific rules or weaknesses, the Kraken could be reshaped for any context. Its size could be exaggerated to match the scale of the story. Its behavior could range from animalistic instinct to near-divine intelligence. It could be portrayed as an ancient god of the sea or as a misunderstood beast defending its territory. Each portrayal added new layers to the legend, ensuring that it never grew stale. The monster's association with the ocean also gave it a timeless quality. Even in the modern world, the sea remains a source of mystery. Vast areas are still unexplored, and creatures continue to be discovered in the depths. This reality allows the Kraken to remain plausible, even in fantasy. Audiences accept that something enormous might still lurk unseen, making the monster an ideal candidate for modern storytelling. The boundary between myth and possibility is thin enough to keep the legend alive. In addition, the Kraken's rise in popular culture coincided with the growth of global entertainment. Films, games, and novels crossed borders more easily than ever before, bringing the monster to audiences far removed from its northern origins. The Kraken became a universal figure, known not because of local folklore but because of global media. Children in distant countries who had never heard of Norwegian sagas recognized the Kraken through cartoons or movies. It had been lifted out of its cultural birthplace and transformed into a shared image for the entire world. The commercial potential of the Kraken was also significant. Its dramatic form made it a popular subject for merchandise, from toys and board games to shirts and posters. The monster's image sold not only stories but products, further embedding it in daily life. It was no longer confined to the page or screen. It appeared in the hands of children, on the walls of bedrooms, and in the logos of brands. The Kraken had become not just a story but a marketable identity, an emblem of adventure, danger, and mystery. Yet even as it was commercialized, the Kraken never fully lost its darker roots. Films and books continued to portray it as a force of destruction, reminding audiences of its origins as a terror of the sea. The balance between playful and frightening depictions allowed the legend to thrive across genres and audiences. It could scare adults while entertaining children, a rare flexibility that kept it relevant in a crowded landscape of monsters. By the early 21st century, the Kraken had achieved a kind of immortality that few myths manage. It had moved through folklore, science, metaphor, and art, finally settling into the modern imagination as both monster and icon. It was a creature that could be feared, fought, laughed at, or celebrated, depending on the story being told. Its survival across centuries shows the enduring human need for monsters, and the Kraken, with its immense size and hidden presence, remains one of the most powerful of all. The Kraken has always been more than a monster. When you look closely at the way it has been imagined, drawn, and feared, it becomes clear that the creature speaks to something deep within the human mind. Myths that last across centuries are rarely about what they seem on the surface. They endure because they express something universal, something that people in every time and place can recognize. With the Kraken, that universal theme is the fear of the unseen and the overwhelming. It is a reflection not only of the ocean but of the human psyche itself. At the heart of the Kraken legend is the terror of what lies beneath. The surface of the sea appears calm, endless, even beautiful, but it hides a vast world beyond our senses. Sailors in earlier centuries lived with this reality every day. They looked down into dark waters that revealed nothing, yet they knew that something was moving there. When strange shapes appeared, when shadows shifted beneath their ships, they felt the presence of a hidden force. This is the essence of the Kraken, the embodiment of everything we cannot see but cannot stop imagining. Psychologists have long noted how humans fill gaps in perception with imagination. The darker the unknown, the more terrifying the imagined presence becomes. A shadow in the forest might hide a predator, so the mind assumes danger. The endless dark of the ocean magnifies this tendency. With nothing visible, the imagination supplies creatures of impossible size and power. The Kraken is the ultimate version of this process, a projection of human fear onto the unseen spaces of the sea. The monster also speaks to our fascination with scale. People are awed and unsettled by things that dwarf them. Mountains, storms, and vast animals all trigger a mixture of wonder and dread. The Kraken takes this fascination to the extreme. It is not simply larger than a whale or a ship. It is described as island-sized, as something so immense that it redefines what life can be. Facing such scale forces humans to confront their own smallness. The Kraken is terrifying because it reminds us of our place in the world, fragile, temporary, and vulnerable. There is also something psychological in the way the Kraken strikes. It does not emerge like a predator on land, visible from a distance. Instead, it waits unseen, then erupts suddenly, dragging victims below before they can react. This pattern mirrors human anxieties about sudden disaster. People fear accidents not only for the harm they cause, but for their unpredictability. The Kraken embodies that unpredictability, the sense that at any moment, something vast and hidden could rise up and erase us. The whirlpools attributed to the Kraken also have a symbolic power. A whirlpool pulls downward, swallowing everything in its reach. It represents inevitability, the fear that no effort can prevent being dragged under. To sailors, this was a real hazard, but psychologically it also echoed feelings of helplessness in the face of overwhelming forces. The Kraken's whirlpools became metaphors for fate, chaos, and destruction. They were physical and emotional symbols at once. The dual nature of the Kraken, both a provider of fish and a destroyer of ships, also reveals something about human psychology. People often view nature as both nurturing and dangerous, giving life while threatening it. The Kraken captures this paradox perfectly. It stirs the sea so that fish rise, feeding those who risk fishing near it, but it also threatens to consume the very same men. This contradiction mirrors the way humans experience the natural world as a whole. We rely on it for survival, yet it can kill us without warning. The Kraken is an extreme expression of this uneasy relationship. Modern thinkers often interpret the Kraken as a symbol of the unconscious mind. Just as the ocean hides vast depths beneath its surface, so too does the human mind hide thoughts, fears, and desires beneath awareness. The Kraken becomes a metaphor for those forces, immense, hidden, and capable of breaking through when least expected. Dreams of drowning, nightmares of being dragged under, or anxieties that rise suddenly all echo the image of the Kraken. It is not only a monster of the sea, but a monster of the mind. The adaptability of the Kraken as metaphor shows how deeply it connects to universal fears. In times of exploration, it represented the dangers of uncharted waters. In times of industrial change, it symbolized unstoppable systems. In modern culture, it can stand for environmental collapse, overwhelming bureaucracy, or even personal struggles. The common thread is always the same. The Kraken embodies forces too large to control, too hidden to anticipate, and too relentless to escape. It is worth noting how the Kraken differs from other legendary creatures in this psychological role. Dragons, for example, often represent greed or destruction but are visible, fiery, and direct. Vampires represent seduction and corruption but act through manipulation. The Kraken, by contrast, is faceless and hidden. Its threat is not in its personality but in its enormity and invisibility. This makes it more abstract, more primal. It does not tempt or trick. It simply exists, vast and indifferent, and that indifference is what terrifies us most. The legend also taps into humanity's deep fear of drowning. Few deaths are more primal in their horror than being pulled beneath the water, lungs filling with salt, light fading above. The Kraken makes this fear personal. It is not just the ocean swallowing you, but a creature with intent. It takes the universal human terror of drowning and gives it a face, or more accurately, arms. This personalization makes the fear more vivid, more haunting, and more enduring. At the same time, the Kraken also reflects a human need for wonder. Fear and fascination are closely linked, and many sailors who spoke of the Kraken did so with awe as well as dread. To believe in such a creature is to believe that the world is larger than we can fully know. In a sense, the Kraken preserves mystery, offering an antidote to the flattening certainty of total explanation. Even now, when science has revealed so much, people cling to the possibility of creatures that remain unseen. The Kraken satisfies that desire for the world to be bigger and stranger than we imagine. By the 21st century, the psychological meaning of the Kraken had become as important as the folklore itself. The monster had transcended its role as a literal beast and become a symbol of fear, scale, unpredictability, and hidden power. It was no longer just a story told by sailors, but a reflection of the human mind confronting forces it cannot control. This is why the legend endures. The Kraken is not simply in the ocean, it is in us, in our dreams, our anxieties, and our fascination with the unknown. The story of the Kraken has taken us across centuries, from Viking sailors on fragile ships to modern filmmakers with digital effects, from the cold waters of Norway to the imaginations of people around the world. Along the way, the monster has changed form countless times. It has been an island mistaken for land, a squid with arms longer than ships, a whirlpool dragging sailors into the abyss, a metaphor for political corruption, a cinematic spectacle, and a symbol of human psychology. Few legends have endured with such flexibility, and fewer still have become so universally recognizable. What makes the Kraken remarkable is not only its monstrous scale, but its ability to survive in the shifting tides of culture. In the age of oral tales, it was passed from sailor to sailor, whispered in the dark corners of taverns where men drank away the memory of storms. In the age of naturalists, it found a place in books, catalogued alongside whales and strange fish as if it were just another species awaiting discovery. In the age of art, it spread across engravings and paintings, its curling arms reaching into the imagination of those who had never set foot on a ship. In the age of cinema and games, it became a creature of spectacle and interactivity, battled by heroes and feared by audiences. Through each transformation, the Kraken kept its essence, a force too large, too hidden, and too overwhelming to escape. The endurance of this myth shows that the Kraken is not only a monster of the sea but a monster of the human condition. It speaks to our deepest fears, the fear of what we cannot see, the fear of being small in the face of something vast, the fear of being dragged under without warning. At the same time, it speaks to our fascination with the unknown. The Kraken is terrifying, yes, but it is also alluring. It represents the possibility that the world is still full of secrets, that no matter how much we map and measure, there will always be mysteries beyond our reach. Even in the 21st century, when satellites scan the oceans and submarines descend into the deep, the Kraken remains alive. Part of this is because of real creatures that echo the legend. The discovery and study of giant squid have confirmed that enormous beings do inhabit the depths, their eyes unblinking, their arms covered in hooks. These animals are real, yet they are rarely seen, and their lives remain shrouded in mystery. Each new glimpse fuels the imagination. If such creatures exist, why not larger ones? Why not something that matches the stories of old? The Kraken lingers at the edge of science because the ocean itself is still largely unexplored. But the Kraken also survives because it is more than biology. It has become a language, a symbol used whenever people need to describe something overwhelming and inescapable. Political cartoonists draw it when empires expand, writers invoke it when systems feel impossible to fight, filmmakers summon it when they need an image of unstoppable destruction, children imagine it when they see shadows under the water. The Kraken belongs to everyone now, shaped and reshaped to meet whatever fear or fascination the world demands. There is a kind of beauty in this adaptability. Legends often fade when science intrudes, but the Kraken has only grown stronger. Explanation did not destroy it. Instead, it gave it new life, anchoring it in reality while leaving space for imagination. The giant squid may explain part of the story, but the rest belongs to the human mind, which refuses to let go of the possibility of something larger. In this way, the Kraken embodies the balance between knowledge and mystery. It reminds us that even in a world of facts, we still need myths. Perhaps that is why the Kraken continues to inspire awe. It is not only a creature of destruction but a reminder of scale. Standing on the shore, looking out across endless waves, it is easy to feel insignificant. The ocean stretches beyond the horizon, deeper than mountains, older than civilizations. The Kraken is that feeling made flesh, the embodiment of the ocean's immensity. To imagine it is to confront the limits of human power and the vastness of the world we inhabit. And yet, there is comfort in the Kraken as well. To believe in it is to believe that the world is still wild, still capable of surprising us. In an age when so much feels mapped and controlled, the Kraken is a whisper that not everything has been explained. There are still places where the unknown waits, still shadows too deep for light to reach, still mysteries that cannot be reduced to data. The Kraken is not only a monster but a reminder of wonder. In the end, whether the Kraken exists as a living creature is less important than the fact that it exists in human imagination. Myths endure not because they are proven, but because they tell truths that facts cannot. The Kraken tells us that the world is vast, that danger and beauty lie side by side, that the unknown is both terrifying and necessary. It tells us that we are small, and that in our smallness we create stories to make sense of the immensity around us. That is why the Kraken has survived for so long, and why it will continue to surface in the stories of future generations. So when we speak of the Kraken, we are not just speaking of a monster in the sea, we are speaking of ourselves, of our fears and our hopes, our desire for safety and our craving for mystery. The Kraken is as much a part of the human story as it is of the oceans, and that is why, after centuries of whispers, drawings, poems, and films, it is still with us. It will always be with us, rising in our imagination like it once rose in the tales of sailors, waiting just beneath the surface, ready to remind us that the world is larger, stranger, and more powerful than we can ever fully know.